The production of this documentary was provided by the Reynolds and Reynolds Company on behalf of and in association with NAMAD, the National Association of Minority Automobile Dealers, and the Rainbow Push Coalition. Additional funding was provided by the National Automobile Dealers Association, the General Motors Company, the Ford Motor Company, the Chrysler Motor Company, Steve Harrell, Coastal Motor Cars, and these fine supporters. Americans' love affair with the automobile is both a backdrop to the American dream and a centerpiece of Americana. A single invention that shaped our culture, defined generations, and transformed an economy. Part fashion and part function, part status, part necessity, the automobile became synonymous with the freedom to travel, explore, begin again. Freedom became movement, movement became freedom, and unlike traveling by rail or air, driving a car would take you wherever blue highways would reach. Along the way, the view of America became the view from inside the car, uniquely individual. And the American dream became more personal, one car at a time. Yet nestled among images of the automobile and the American dream are other, more stubborn images of a dream deferred, or as Langston Hughes wrote, America, the land that never was, and yet must be. The story of the automobile and dealerships in America, of buying and selling cars, is our story. Neighbors, entrepreneurs, visionaries, ordinary men and women with extraordinary spirit who are adding their contribution to America to make America the land it must be. African American, Hispanic, Native American, and Asian Americans of legendary talent and determination. Individuals who stepped forward in a role rightfully theirs in the American dream. And yet, the dream was not African American or Hispanic or Asian or Native American. It was simply our dream. This documentary is the first in a series that will explore the dreaming of America through the pioneers in automotive retailing. Pioneers whose backgrounds were as different as the models they would soon sell. Because their story is the story of America, the story of a dream deferred, realized, and continually renewed.
From the time African Americans were freed from slavery, we have sought equity and parity in all aspects of American life. It has been a continuing struggle to tear down the racial barriers which has prevented minorities, especially African Americans, from achieving the American dream. Over 100 years later, the vision is beginning to become a reality, and the ability to acquire wealth is now considered the last frontier for all minorities, particularly African Americans. One of the businesses in which minorities have made inroads for inclusion is the retail automotive business. It's a high-risk business, but one that can yield significant rewards for those who are successful. From 1898 until 1960, dealerships were owned and operated by white males. There were few exceptions. In fact, during that 60-year period, there were only 3 dealerships operated by African Americans. Today, the numbers have changed, reflecting some progress. There are now more than 1,300 minority dealerships representing about 6% of the industry. While a measure of success has been achieved, this success didn't just happen. Many paid a heavy price in the quest for the American dream. They created a path for others, but there would be suffering, sacrifices, and casualties along the way. These pioneers were the first to break down the barriers in the retail automotive business. They were the risk takers, the trailblazers. They were the ones who paved the way, and they must not be forgotten. The history of what has been accomplished serves as a constant reminder that there's much more to be done in this ongoing struggle for equity and parity.
Hold my hand.
Historians estimate that 15 million Africans were ripped from their native land and transported across the Atlantic Ocean between 1500 and 1870. Historical evidence documents this history of brutality, forced separation from our families, beatings with whips, branding, rape, hangings, denial of education, and all forms of physical and mental torture with the intent to break our will, instill fear, and destroy our dignity as human beings. These crimes, along with the exploitation of our involuntary labor, fueled the economic growth of this country during the 1800s. It was the struggle by people of African descent to assert their dignity as human beings and resist their constant humiliation and degradation that formed the foundation of the struggle for freedom and parity that continues today.
Walk with me, Lord. Walk with me.
During the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, African Americans struggled with some success to acquire their own land. However, in 1876, when federal troops were removed from the South, the Negro question was permitted to become once again a Southern question. By 1910, African Americans had become disenfranchised in Southern states. Most African Americans were laboring in dirty, back-breaking, dangerous jobs. The majority of them were employed in agriculture.
Seven trees bearing strange fruit.
Racist violence became rampant. Blacks who owned successful businesses were sometimes victimized by white capping, the deliberate destruction by racist whites of black-owned properties, sometimes resulting in the murder of the owners.
Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze.
Under these cruel conditions, hundreds of thousands of African Americans fled the conditions of the South, seeking economic opportunity in the North. One catalyst for this move was Henry Ford. In 1915, the Ford Motor Company announced pay of $5 per day for those willing to work in the iron and steel furnaces of the now famous Rouge complex. The work environment was excruciating, but it represented economic opportunity for those who were denied it in the cotton fields of the South. Approximately 400,000 African Americans moved to Detroit and other auto-related business communities over the next decade. Out of this migration, our first African American pioneers in automotive retailing emerged. Our men of steel, the very first, Homer B. Roberts. In the early 1900s, Roberts worked in the retail business, probably servicing vehicles. In 1917, he joined the Army and served in France, where he was highly decorated and became the first African American to be promoted to officer status. Upon returning to Kansas City, he began brokering new and used cars. His business expanded so rapidly that he built a dealership facility in 1923, which housed such makes as Hupmobile, Rickenbacker, and Whippet. Roberts leased space to numerous retail businesses, possibly making him the first minority owner of a retail shopping mall. He moved to Chicago in 1929 and opened a second Hupmobile dealership and remained in the car business until 1941. During the 1930s, the development of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, better enabled blacks to gain employment in more lucrative union jobs and to increasingly play central roles in a series of important strikes.
The real first black pioneers were the black workers in the foundries, the black workers on the assembly lines, the black workers who joined UAW and got pensions and got strength and became a huge black middle class.
It was also during the 1930s that Dan Gaines and Ed Davis emerged as entrepreneurs in the retail car business. In August 1936, Dan Gaines Ford Inc. opened for business on the south side of Chicago. He remained the Ford dealer until 1940. Following in Dan Gaines' tracks was Ed Davis. On December 4th, 1939, Davis made history by being awarded a Studebaker franchise. He resigned the Studebaker franchise in 1955 and in 1957 was appointed a sub-dealer for a local Ford dealer. The goal was for him to reach out to the black community. Years later, in November 1963, Ed Davis would make history again. He was awarded the Chrysler Plymouth franchise in Detroit, the first African American to receive a Big Three franchise. In 1999, Ed Davis was inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame as the first African American to be awarded a new car franchise by the Big Three in the post-World War II period. During the late 1940s and into the 1950s, African Americans acted as agents or brokers for majority-owned dealerships, the belief being that blacks could sell best to blacks. Most of this occurred in the major markets, such as Chicago, Detroit, and New York.
Dad was a mechanic at a white-owned dealership, and it dawned on him one day that, with all the relatives and friends that he had, he certainly could sell cars like he saw a lot of the salesmen doing, and wear a nice new suit and drive a new car. And so he approached the owner of that dealership about selling, and after much convincing, they finally agreed to it, but they told him that if he did, he would have to sell cars from the service entrance. Very quickly, he became the top salesman there, and later decided that he'd had enough of that he didn't need to sell from the service entrance. If he was going to be the top salesman, he was going to do it from the showroom. So at that point, it caused him to want to go out and seek employment elsewhere, which he did, and worked for a place called Thomas Beckley Dodge. As time went on, the owners of it decided to sell Thomas Beckley Dodge to him for a minuscule amount of money, just to basically transfer ownership. And that was my dad's first automobile dealership in 1950.
When I first started, it did offend me that I couldn't sell cars on the showroom floor. It did offend me at first, because I was determined not be like some person that sells a car and you take it to a salesman and he works the deal out and you get a bird dog fee. And they had a book about yay thick, where in those days they had the color paint in inserts, even the cloth in the book, the outline of the exterior of the car. So I thought, hey, with all this visual material, if I'm going to sell and can't sell on a showroom floor, then I'll sell them in their offices and in their homes. I was known as the salesman that sold cars out of a briefcase. By 1954, my income from selling cars out of that briefcase was $60,000 a year. Well, during all those years, I wrote to every manufacturer. I had money to be able, I thought, I had enough cash to buy a dealership with their systems of, like they put every other dealer in. I spent something like 13 years begging for an opportunity to buy a dealership.
The tide was turning against racial discrimination, and a number of key events would take place before Al Johnson would become the first African-American GM dealer, nearly 13 years later. In 1962, while Johnson was fighting to be awarded a GM dealership, Bob Nelson, Bob Neal, and C.G. Harrison were awarded import franchises, the first African Americans to accomplish this. A member of the Tuskegee Airmen, Bob Nelson served with distinction in both World War II and the Korean War. After returning to Chicago, he entered the car service business in the late 50s. In 1961, Nelson acquired 2 import franchises. In 1967, he partnered with Ernie Banks, the legendary Chicago Cubs baseball player, and operated Nelson Banks Ford Inc., the first African-American Ford franchise in the post-World War II era. Also in the service business on the south side of Chicago, Bob Neal acquired both Triumph and BMW franchises in 1962. Later, he added a number of other franchises, including Toyota, Pontiac, Jaguar, Honda, and Dodge, making him the first African-American mega dealer. Raised in the Danville, Virginia area, C.G. Harrison sold used cars for several years. In July 1966, he acquired a Fiat franchise and later acquired Volvo. He remains active in the retail business today. The 1960s brought a wave of progress for African Americans. Our community held a diverse range of ideas on how to best achieve our freedom, but our collective efforts is what ultimately initiated change. Following the powerful I Have a Dream message of the Reverend Martin Luther King and the riots of 1966 and 1967, white America and corporate America began to change the way they did business with minorities, particularly African Americans.
Then after the Voting Rights Act was realized, there was this explosion of black vision of entrepreneurship, and not merely being consumers, but being producers and being entrepreneurs and being business people. Out of this climate, Al Johnson emerges notably with this automobile dealership.
And the only reason that I think it ended up getting it by 67 was the Reverend Martin Luther King. I made an appeal to him by sending a letter. And he talked to the president, and they had a meeting, and his whole theme was, why limit these people to being consumers only? Why can't they own a dealership? And the president then had convinced the corporate folk president and chairman of the board of these various corporations that this was wrong, and they were trying to correct the situation. And that's what really happened.
Corporate America had received the wake-up call, and the Big Three got the message. The wheels of change were in motion. The era of African-American owned car dealers began to get traction. Roberts, Gaines, and Davis, along with these individuals, were the pioneers. There was a honeymoon period in which newly wedded manufacturers and the still relatively few African American dealers were getting to know each other. However, real business issues began to surface: capitalization, training, and deep-seated institutionalized racism.
The conventional wisdom of the manufacturers of the time was that if you were of a particular ethnic group, that you would most likely be successful selling cars in that particular ethnic neighborhood. And as such, black dealers were put into black communities. Some of the dealership opportunities were in dilapidated or at the very least old neighborhoods.
And so that was that real tough struggle in the beginning because we were being put in dealerships that did not have a chance to succeed. And so that was very critical time and also whether the manufacturer were doing it because of on purpose or they was doing it because of ignorance. It happened.
I remember many spring mornings going to the basement to find that there was 4 feet of water in the boiler room. I remember having to open the service, having to shoo winos away from the service entrance door in order to open the service department in the morning.
Chrysler made history in 1968 in establishing the first informal minority dealer training program. And Vernon Smalls was the first minority with retail experience to be hired by the Big Three to help train individuals.
This young reporter came up, and of course Mr. Townsend, who was at that time chairman of Chrysler Corporation, was coming out of the meeting, and she had heard about Ed Davis being the only black dealer in the entire United States. And she walked up to Mr. Townsend and she stuck a mic in his mouth and said, Mr. Townsend, is it true that there's only one black dealer in the entire United States? And of course, Mr. Townsend was a slow-speaking person, and he says, why, yes, that's correct. Well, Mr. Townsend, do you think that's fair, that you have only one black dealer and all the black people that buy your product? Well, if we had more qualified people, we'd have more dealers tomorrow. Mr. Townsend, how do you expect them to become qualified if you only hire them for busboys and porters? Well, we'll start a minority training program. Are you saying that you'll start a training program to train blacks to be dealers? That's right. And that's how the whole program got started.
This was the beginning of significant training efforts to develop an inventory of qualified candidates to be considered dealers. In 1971, Ford launched the first middle management program.
When I got into the minority dealer operations of Ford Motor Company, we did a survey along Mel Farr, who was a football player, played with the Detroit Lions, and became one of our best dealers. He was a summer intern, and I was working with Levi Jackson. It was the three of us trying to put together a middle management training program.
They found out that they needed a dealer training program because they were just not blacks who moved up through the ranks of the dealerships to be taking managerial positions, and that's where Ford really got its deals from.
The president of GM and all of its top marketing people and division people were at a table in this conference room. And I was invited to come up and meet with them. I walked into this room and saw all these people, and I thought, oh God, I'm out of place. I don't know what the hell they want, but gee, I don't, it was just strange. And they got right to the point. And the point was, Al, how do you explain that you're so successful and the majority of the minority dealers are failing and going broke and bankrupt? And I said, I think it's about time that you guys recognize that we need an academy. And I gave each one of them copies of Jerome Williams' plan for a training program. He wrote a training program about that thick. This is historic. GM has it today. 2 years in the classroom environment and 9 months at a very minimum working in a successful dealership. where this person would go through each department. That's the only way that we can catch up for the neglect of not being involved in this business for over 90 years.
In 1972, GM launched its formalized GM Minority Dealer Training Program, which consisted of 10 African Americans.
Following my encouragement of encouraging General Motors to invest in an academy, and we were having so many other failures with Ford and Chrysler and the like, we thought that place to go would go to see Jesse.
So once we had about 7 blacks in Ford and Chrysler and GM, and they were told to stay away from each other. It was real, like GM had a certain mentality, and Ford a certain mentality, and Chrysler a certain mentality. They wouldn't meet. So I asked for a meeting in Chicago. If I recall, like 7 or 8 came to that meeting.
And I was inspired by him getting up out of the house, coming out of the hospital with pneumonia, trying to put a group of guys together to, I guess what I would say, to petition the companies for better treatment for minorities, better opportunities, and that kind of thing, training and the thing that we needed at that time.
There may have been 7 black dealers and 30 white overseers. I mean, there were 4 or 5 deep of whites from the big 3. In effect saying, A, stay away from civil rights stuff, you are business people. And stay away from each other, you are competitors. So if you stay away from each other, you cannot share and collaborate. If you stay away from civil rights, you don't have the pressure to make things happen.
And so we had that meeting in 1970 and clearly laid out a plan to organize African American automobile dealers across manufacturers' lines into an organization that could articulate their needs and their plans.
In time, they began to see that only power can speak to power, and only organization can speak to organization.
We left Chicago not having formed an organization. And Reverend Jackson was depressed that we could not see it, but he planted the seed.
The National Black Automobile Dealer Association, NBADA, became a reality in August 1970. Nathan Conyers was selected its first president, and Horace Noble, a Dodge dealer, appointed in 1969, was selected its treasurer. The fact is that NBADA was an organization in name only. It had little funds, the membership changed frequently as dealers went in and out of business, and it exercised little influence with the manufacturers. But 1979 was the year of change, with the realization that minority dealers needed to speak with one voice.
The guy that really started sending out letters to form the Black Ford and Lincoln Mercury Dealer Association was a Ford Motor Company employee, a person named Judson B. Powell.
The way it started is almost amazing. In '77, I kind of went to our dealers, I said, you guys really need a voice to senior management. You need to form an association. They were all making money, they were doing well. Oh, we don't need an association. What do you think about that, Joe? Oh no, we don't need an association. 1 year later, they would beat me across the head to form an association because everyone in the room was about to go out of business except Bill Shack. He was the only profitable dealer in the room.
I became the first president of the organization because out of all the people that were involved at the time, mind you, there were 16 Ford and Lincoln Mercury dealers. I was the only one that was not only profitable but owned my business. And this was 1979.
So in the spring of 1980, a group of minority dealers came together to establish a national minority agenda. These pioneers spearheaded the beginning of a national minority dealer organization and established a connection with various key business governmental agencies.
The interest rate went up to about 18%, and gasoline prices went up.
Automobile industry is in awful shape. Chrysler is going to go under. We lost half of the black dealers that were in business in that 1 year.
They said that if we were going to be successful in getting the funds, we needed to broaden our association. We need to include all minorities, all right, so it's not a single interest group.
Therefore, we formed NAMAD under the direction of Dan Hansen, the Department of Commerce, out of necessity.
We convened a meeting of all minority dealers in Washington, D.C. in 1980. And a good number of them, not only African Americans, but Hispanic and Indians came to that meeting. We had probably over 50 dealers there.
By forming NAMAD, we had to bring all of these different fractions together. In addition, we had to deal with the different manufacturers' perception of what we were doing. I mean, we were viewed initially as some type of rebel organization. I don't know why, because our whole concept was about betterment of ourselves in the automotive industry.
At the time, I had a brother in the Congress of the United States, Congressman John Conyers, who'd been there since '64. He was an activist. We were activists.
These got to be pretty sticky issues. We were all in there working with them. Reverend Jesse Jackson, we had the NAACP helping us. We had the Urban League working with us.
Jimmy Carter had called the black dealers to come to Washington, D.C. because we were dying. We were going out of business every day.
In the summer of 1980, President Carter flew into Metropolitan Airport and in a speech announced the help that the federal government was going to give to the automobile industry.
And Jimmy Carter called us an endangered species. As an endangered species under the Farm Act bill, that allowed the SBA to give us direct money.
That was a real critical part, because if it wasn't for that loan, I wouldn't have made it.
Even though the Big Three made strong statements of commitment to the diversification of their dealer networks, their actions didn't always follow through. Reverend Jackson visited both GM and Ford to seek greater commitment and support not only for minority dealerships, but to also increase the number of minority employees and suppliers. These meetings took place in both 1982 and 1984.
He negotiated a deal with Phil Benton, who was then the president of Ford Motor Company, to put 30 dealers in 1 year.
I met with Phil Benton and Mel Farr and Nathan Conyers and Bill Shack and a few of us. And we said, given the consumer numbers, we should have at least 30 black dealerships as a start. He said, the market can stand that. The whites in the room went off, as if to say to Phil Benton, are you serious? I mean, 30 in a year? Phil says, and the person in charge will report directly to me. Will not get lost in bureaucracies, levels 4, 5, and 6. So everybody got kind of sobered up. It went so well so quickly. We met the next year, and Phil said we can get 300 dealerships. That's when Ford made the big explosive move onto the market. At that time, GM and Chrysler had to catch up because Ford was out there based upon Phil Benton's leadership.
There are a lot of people who, in their own way, played a role that, in the mosaic of things, fit together to create a very positive program at Ford Motor Company that we could then take over to Chrysler and to General Motors.
Chrysler started a real nice and successful program. They did well on that. Jesse Jones led the Chrysler dealers.
He was a tremendous man. I mean, he was. We just glowed when we was around him because he was our pioneer. He was our first. He was our George Washington. This guy, to me, was everything. He stood up for us. He sacrificed a lot for us. Not only sacrificed a lot for the Chrysler minority dealers, he sacrificed a lot for black dealers, period.
Jess was quite an individual in his own little way, I always thought, particularly when it comes to negotiating. He had listened to everything. And maybe after some time or later and thinking about it, he'd have the right answer from a good human relations standpoint. He'd come up with a good so-called program.
We decided that we needed an independent association. And in Chicago, we met in 1986 and formed the General Motors Black Dealer Association, an independent association from the Advisory Council to speak as an independent voice about the interests of its African American dealers. Out of that has grown the General Motors Minority Automobile Dealer Association, which is much more inclusive now.
Where the associations known as now black organizations or African American organizations became minority organizations, which included African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, and Asian Americans. And as a result of that, I think we have found ourselves to be a much stronger organization, found ourselves to be much stronger dealers.
For us to be successful, we have to embrace that in a diverse culture. So it does make in a business sense to embrace every different ethnicity in our mainstream.
I think that the mood started to change like in 1989 and I'm talking about the GM Association. And when we had our first banquet and we had the Lloyd Royce as our keynote speaker. And I mean, he was the president of General Motors. And I think that's when the other minority dealers said, well, wait a minute. I had a chance to be at dinner with Lloyd Royce, but I wasn't a member of the association. That's when they knew we were serious about our efforts and that, if the president of GM would come in and be our keynote speaker, they felt serious that some of the things we were trying to accomplish was for their benefit.
We're making a lot of progress, but there's still a lot of work left to be done. And the association can speak with a voice of independence because it has the power and the opportunity to act. And, pleading your case without any strength behind it. And it's not just one dealer speaking. It's an entire group.
Because of the close association that the line groups, being Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, had with the manufacturer, that close relationship prevented the line group presidents from being proactive in trying to achieve certain results because of the backlash as related to them personally. So a buffer is what NAMAD became between the line groups and the manufacturer. NAMAD could say things to the manufacturer that the line group presidents were uncomfortable saying.
10, 15, 20 years ago, NAMAD was an organization that was primarily focused on African Americans, and that was an adjunct from the civil rights movement because that was primarily focused on African American. About 5 years ago, we had a chairman, Marty Kumba, who really enlightened us to the fact that you can no longer look at things in black and white. Marty was the first Latino chairman that we had at NAMAD, and he really challenged us to think about whether or not we were walking the walk that we were asking others to walk. And so now if you look at all of the organizations, you will see that they are multicultural.
The biggest success NAMAD has had has been having a cooperation among all minority bodies to come under one. I know there's been talk about different organizations and separation and so on and so forth, but we have found when everybody speaks under one voice that is much beneficial.
In our dealer body and in our dealer count, we are losing we are gaining as minorities, but we're losing as black dealers. And that is something that we as an associate have to address those issues.
And so, yeah, there's going to be friction. And the thing that we have to always guard against is let's not tear up ourselves. And that's what NAMAD, to me, was formed for.
Well, my vision is that we have to have a collective effort of all minorities. You see, they can't pit blacks against Hispanics or Hispanics against Asians and others for a piece of that small pie. As a collective group, we should be working together for a larger piece of the economic pie that says, this is ours, we deserve it, and a reciprocal relationship that deals with what we buy, what we spend, and where we should be in this process.
When Mr. Harrell came in, they succeeded me in the chairmanship.
he had been in all the committees, all the meetings, so he knew what the battles were and where the battle lines were drawn. That's when he came up with the 15% solution.
As people of color become a larger part of the consumer base of the U.S. population and of automotive entrepreneurs, we've got to have a bigger slice of the pie. And that's why NAMAD came up with the 15% formula for success.
At the time that the formula was put in place, we had only 5% of the deals. So we felt that it would be better to eat this elephant one piece at a time. We didn't ask for the 25%. We asked for 15%. In asking for 15%, we knew that we would triple the number of dealers that was in place.
NAMAD's 15% formula for success. Why did the manufacturers say yes, we agree to it? Because they had one group, one body representing all minorities coming on board saying this is the right thing to do.
Well, if you look at parity within the African American Hispanic communities in 20 years, that group is going to be the majority. They're going to be somewhere between 45 and 50% of the population of this country.
My hat is really off to Nathan and the guys that were on the battlefield initially as it relates to NAMAD because of the environment that they were in. I mean, this was 25 years ago, and certainly things were altogether different at that time. The obstacles was higher, and these guys are to be commended for the things that they were able to achieve.
This movement was initiated by African American pioneers, and we should pay due respect for their effort, and we should build on, based on their effort, build on something bigger and better.
In the struggle to make this a more complete union, I would argue there, as a way of describing it, 4 stages. Stage 1, from 1619 to 1865, was to end slavery. And then from 1865 really to 1954 was to fight to end Jim Crow. Then the right to vote, stage 3. But you can be out of slavery, out of Jim Crow, have the right to vote and starve to death unless you can get access to capital, industry, and technology. This is the 4th stage of our struggle.
I think today it is clear that people of color can travel anywhere they want to. People of color have the same right to one vote as any other American citizen, but there is a huge disparity between the net worth of people of color in the aggregate as it relates to Caucasians. And one of the things that we are really focusing on is building wealth and providing ways to transfer that wealth intergenerationally. And I think until we are on par as it relates to economic rights, which in my opinion leads to power, then we are still got a lot of work to do.
For over 30 million African Americans, the events that started over 50 years ago have significantly transformed American democracy. Only a generation ago, blacks had been virtually invisible in a number of areas in American society: government, entertainment, sports, and industry.
We've come quite a distance, and it was because of those early dealers like Ed Davis, my brother, and many other, Mel Farr, who came through and helped create a level playing field. Reverend Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Push organization was very instrumental and still are working in the area.
The forefathers
I respect them greatly. I admired them greatly, their tenacity, their fortitude, their pioneer spirit, because they were charting waters that were uncharted. They were swimming in the sea with the sharks, and they survived. Not one of them have forgotten where they came from. They gave back to their communities, they gave back, they formed the associations to make it better for the next generation. And that's what puts them in the category of great men, not just great businessmen, but great men.
There were a lot of people that sold a lot of automobiles in various circumstances, and I think that whoever they were, whatever they did, whether they were first or not, whether they were authorized or not, their accomplishments shouldn't be forgotten, and we should pay homage to that.
Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down and shaken together and running over. I think the responsibility of the dealers that come after me and my generation is to recognize the history of this organization and give to the oncoming generation what has been made available to them.
My children will be the first generation that's probably grown up without exposure to a major civil rights struggle that was documented on TV. And so I think it's really important for all of us to understand the sacrifices that those brave people made in order for us to be able to participate in the industry.
We all stand to gain when there's growth. What's the key to growth? Inclusion. Inclusion leads to growth. And when there's growth, everybody wins.
It would be nice if you could be fair and get some of the brotherhood and sisterhood in those stores to learn those things. That's the challenge you got today with our dealers. That's what NAMAD was about, to help pull someone up by the bootstraps.
But we have to look to the present and the future for those people who are going to carry the banner, who's going to be creative enough. We need to see what comes after Jesse Jackson, what comes after Bill Shack, what comes after those people who were there in the beginning. If new buds do not develop, then you have no right to exist. You will die.
A 500-year struggle for freedom and a 140-year effort for equity and parity. Unfortunately, we're still not there. We're still celebrating first or minor successes in most professions and areas other than sports and entertainment. Yes, some progress has been made over these last 50 years, but there's still so much left to be done. Freedom has never been free. It has always been won through struggle. As a people and as a part of the auto industry, we have benefited greatly and do stand on the backs of all those before us that fought for freedom and inclusion. Roberts, Davis, Dr. King, and we are fortunate to still have access to the wisdom, tenacity, fortitude, and passion of Conyers, Shack, Johnson, Jackson, and others. Within the manufacturer organization, there have been those who have championed our cause, worked with the minority organizations, and contributed to our advances as well. We thank you. We must never forget the sacrifices of our forefathers and the pioneers that paved the way and have left tracks for us to follow. We must learn from the wisdom of these warriors, be ever grateful to them, and never tolerate injustice nor concede. If we do, their sacrifices will have been in vain. There's much yet to be accomplished. Let's continue to make tracks and lead the way to positive change. I'm Danny Glover. Thank you.